On June 6, 1944, the world watched history shift with the thunder of cannons, the rattle of machine guns, and the echo of boots against the sands of Normandy. It was D-Day, the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. But behind the blood-soaked headlines of Omaha Beach and the heroic struggle across hedgerows, another story was beginning to take shape, one far from the front lines. Within months of that fateful invasion, tens of thousands of captured German soldiers found themselves thousands of miles away from the European war zone, shipped across the Atlantic to the United States of America. They were prisoners of war, but not in the sense they had been taught to fear. Instead of the harsh and brutal captivity that many had expected, they were met with something that would stun them, humble them, and in some cases, make them laugh until their sides ached, the taste of American food. These men, hardened by years of military discipline and nourished on the thin rations of a nation at war, were suddenly confronted with meals so abundant, so flavorful, and in some cases so bizarre, that their first bites felt less like punishment and more like stepping into another world. And in the mess halls of POW camps scattered across the American South and Midwest, the simple act of eating became a story of astonishment, irony, and humanity. The journey begins here, in 1944, America, where the prisoners who once fought with deadly seriousness against Allied forces found themselves laughing at plates of fried chicken, cornbread, and Coca-Cola. To understand why, we must step into their shoes, sit at their tables, and listen to their stories. Because in the taste of food, they discovered not only the shock of cultural difference, but also the strange paradox of being treated with dignity by the very enemy they had been ordered to destroy. The transport trains screeched into the depots of small American towns with a metallic groan that echoed against the quiet of the countryside. To the men inside, German prisoners taken in the months following D-Day, the sound was almost surreal. Only weeks earlier, they had crouched in muddy foxholes, shells exploding around them in the hedgerows of Normandy, the acrid stench of cordite filling their lungs. Now they were staring through barred train windows at wide fields of wheat, barns painted in weathered red, and children waving curiously from the edges of the tracks. Some of the prisoners sat rigid, their faces masks of discipline, but others could not hide their confusion. Where was the rage, the hatred, the promised punishment for men who had fired bullets at American sons? Instead, there was only this calm landscape, with its wide skies and its strange sense of normalcy. The guards, young Americans in khaki uniforms, did not strike the prisoners. They did not shout or brandish their rifles in theatrical menace. They marched them from the train stations toward trucks and buses that would carry them to sprawling compounds ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers. But their tone was businesslike, even casual. For German soldiers raised on tales of the barbaric Yankee spread through Nazi propaganda, the absence of cruelty was puzzling. Some whispered to one another in disbelief. Surely this was temporary. Surely the real punishment was waiting once they were behind closed gates. They braced themselves for hunger, for hard labor on empty stomachs, for the gnawing ache of deprivation they knew all too well from wartime Germany. When they arrived at the camps, many built hastily in states like Texas, Oklahoma, and Georgia, the smell hit them first. Not the stench of unwashed bodies or the sour odor of rotting rations, but the heavy, savory scent of food cooking in bulk. The mess halls, designed to feed hundreds at a time, belched out the perfume of roasting meats, baking bread, and simmering stews. The Germans exchanged skeptical glances. Some laughed bitterly under their breath, convinced it was a trick, a cruel joke to torment them with smells they would never be allowed to taste. They marched into the long halls with walls of bare wood, lined with tables and benches, their boots clicking against the floorboards, stomachs tightening in anticipation of disappointment. But then the trays were revealed. Meatloaf dripping with brown gravy, slabs of cornbread baked golden, potatoes mashed and whipped with butter until they nearly glistened, string beans salted and cooked soft, thick biscuits steaming as they were pulled from tins, bowls of coleslaw sharp with vinegar and sugar, and almost too much to believe, desserts of pies, cookies, and sometimes even ice cream. For men who had grown used to dry bread rations, watery soup, and ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, the spread before them looked like something from a fever dream. At first, no one moved. The Germans eyed their guards, waiting for the cruel laugh, the order to return to their bunks, the slap across the head for daring to hope. But the Americans only gestured to the tables, their expressions calm, even bored. "Go ahead, sit, eat." The first prisoners stepped forward with hesitation, scooping food onto their trays, as though every movement might trigger some hidden punishment. One young man lifted a glass bottle of Coca-Cola, turning it over in his hands as if it were an artifact from another planet. He brought it to his lips, and the fizz exploded across his tongue. He nearly choked from the sudden burn of carbonation, sputtering and coughing, before breaking into laughter that rang down the long hall. His comrades looked at him in alarm, until he raised the bottle with a grin that needed no translation. Others followed, sipping the strange dark drink, laughing as the bubbles tickled their throats and the sweetness overwhelmed them. When they tasted the fried chicken, greasy and seasoned in ways their tongues had never known, the laughter grew louder. They teased one another, exaggerating their astonishment, biting into drumsticks with theatrical delight. Some compared it to the thin rations of black bread and horse meat they had endured on the Eastern Front, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. A few refused at first, suspicious of hidden humiliation, but hunger and the intoxicating smells eroded their resistance. Soon they too were eating with wide eyes, savoring every bite, letting themselves forget for a moment the grey uniforms on their backs and the barbed wire outside. The American guards, leaning against walls with rifles slung lazily, exchanged glances that betrayed the tiniest of smiles. They watched their sworn enemies, men who only weeks earlier had been trying to kill them, reduced to boys, tasting ice cream for the first time. There was something disarming about it, something that undermined the carefully drawn lines of war. Un Guard later wrote in a letter home that he had never thought the enemy would laugh like that, laugh so hard they cried, simply over food. The prisoners' laughter wasn't just about taste. It was about absurdity. How could a nation so wealthy, so abundant in resources, afford to feed its prisoners better than the Reich fed its own soldiers? The irony cut deep. The propaganda they had grown up with painted Americans as decadent, weak, soft men, unprepared for the discipline of real war. Yet here they were, eating meals that tasted like feasts, while their comrades back home stood in ration lines for turnips and cabbage. Some prisoners muttered that this abundance was proof of why they would never defeat America, because how could one conquer a nation whose land seemed to overflow with food even in wartime? There were moments, too, of sheer childlike discovery. One German prisoner, accustomed only to dark rye bread, took a bite of cornbread and immediately burst into laughter, unable to reconcile the sweetness with the texture of bread. Another tried peanut butter for the first time and shook his head in disbelief, muttering to his neighbor that it was either brilliant or disgusting. He couldn't decide which. The strangeness of it all created a surreal atmosphere in the hall, as though they had been transported into a theater performance instead of captivity. The laughter was a release, a way of coping with the impossibility of their new reality. The guards allowed it. Some even encouraged it, sliding extra rolls down the tables or sneaking an extra slice of pie to a prisoner who reminded them of their own brother back home. These small gestures didn't erase the war, didn't erase the grief each side carried, but they carved out cracks in the armor of hatred. Within those cracks, the simple act of sharing food became something bigger than anyone could have imagined. Later, as the days stretched into weeks, the novelty faded, but the memory of that first meal never left the prisoners. Many would write about it years later, recalling the laughter, the taste of Coca-Cola fizzing for the first time on their tongues, the warm biscuits melting with butter. It became for them the moment they realized America was not what they had been taught to believe. It was a land of contradictions, yes, an enemy nation, yet one that treated its captives with humanity. And in the echo of their laughter, something profound lingered. The recognition that even in war, there are spaces where men can be reminded of their shared humanness. Under the hot southern sun, daily life in the American POW camps began to settle into a rhythm, though nothing about it resembled what the German soldiers had braced themselves for during the long voyage across the Atlantic. The barbed wire fences were real, and the watchtowers with their armed guards were a constant reminder of captivity. But within those confines, the routines were startlingly humane. Reveille sounded in the morning, the prisoners lined up for roll call, and then work details were assigned, some to the campgrounds, others to nearby farms, and still others to maintenance tasks that kept the compounds running smoothly. But every day was punctuated by the same moment that quickly became both the most anticipated and the most bizarre: the meals. By the second week, the shock had given way to familiarity, but the laughter still erupted daily in the mess halls. Each new dish brought its own wave of surprise. The soups were thick and hearty, often flavored with ingredients they did not recognize. The bread was softer, whiter than the dense loaves of rye they had known at home. Breakfasts in particular amazed them. In Germany, the morning meal had been a modest affair. Maybe some bread, a smear of jam, or coffee substitute if one was lucky. In America, breakfast was a feast. Eggs scrambled until fluffy, stacks of pancakes dripping with syrup, sizzling strips of bacon whose smoky aroma filled the hall long before the trays appeared. One prisoner, in a letter smuggled home after the war, recalled how he laughed so hard he nearly dropped his fork the first time he poured maple syrup onto pancakes, calling it a dessert disguised as a soldier's meal. Another described the way bacon crackled between his teeth, the salty richness so unlike anything he had ever known, and how the entire table had burst into giggles at the sight of men greedily mopping their plates with biscuits to capture every last drop of gravy. It was in these moments that the irony of their captivity struck hardest. Here they were, enemy combatants, being served food that many of them would not have tasted even in peacetime Germany, let alone during the lean years of the war. Some compared it to the half-starved faces of their families back home, imagining their wives and children lining up with ration cards for meager allotments. The thought was sobering, even painful. but it made the abundance before them all the more absurd. Laughter in this case was not just joy but also disbelief, a way of coping with the contradictions between what they had been told about America and the reality they now tasted 3 times a day. The guards, too, noticed the transformation that meals brought. In the fields, on work details, the prisoners were disciplined, stiff and cautious, always conscious of maintaining a soldierly bearing. But in the mess halls, their rigidity melted. They leaned close, gestured animatedly with forks, and sometimes even dared to share jokes with the guards who walked the aisles. The ice that separated captor and captive thawed most easily over steaming trays of food. Some American soldiers admitted that they found it hard to keep hatred alive while watching their prisoners laugh at their first taste of apple pie or argue loudly over which dessert was superior, chocolate cake or peach cobbler. One sergeant later confessed that it was impossible not to see the humanity in these men when they looked like children discovering sweets for the first time. There were, of course, moments of culture clash. Peanut butter remained a mystery for many. The sticky paste glued their mouths together, and the sight of men struggling to speak through comically muffled voices had the hall erupting in laughter day after day. Similarly, the fizzy sweetness of root beer baffled them. Some swore it tasted like medicine and refused to drink it, while others demanded second helpings simply for the thrill of the carbonation. The prisoners also joked about the American obsession with ice. They laughed at the way drinks were piled high with cubes until they rattled noisily, something utterly foreign to Europeans who rarely used ice at all. Outside the walls, American civilians sometimes reacted with astonishment of their own. Farmers who hired prisoner work details saw firsthand the hearty meals being served to the Germans and muttered angrily that their own families did not always eat so well. Newspapers occasionally carried letters of protest from locals who resented that the enemy was feasting on food their sons at the front could scarcely dream of. But the United States adhered to the Geneva Convention with a strictness that both surprised and unsettled the prisoners. They were treated not as criminals, but as soldiers, fed meals comparable to those of American troops, and allowed dignity even in defeat. This commitment to rules, paradoxically, humbled many Germans more than cruelty would have. Some admitted privately that the generosity made them feel ashamed of their own army's treatment of prisoners. For the younger soldiers, especially those who had grown up during the leanest years of Nazi Germany, the American dining hall became a theater of wonder. One story tells of a boy barely 19 who, upon tasting chocolate milk for the first time, laughed until tears streamed down his face, insisting to his comrades that such a drink must surely be a fairy tale invention. Another recalls how a table of prisoners once broke into song after being served strawberry shortcake, their voices carrying across the camp until the guards shushed them. These moments were not just light-hearted, they were transformative, breaking down the psychological barriers of propaganda. It was hard to hold on to the belief that America was a land of decadence and corruption when one's belly was full of pancakes and pie. In the evenings, as they returned to their barracks, conversations often drifted back to food. Some prisoners began sketching recipes in notebooks, determined to recreate what they had tasted if they ever returned home. They discussed the strange sweetness of American corn, the lightness of the biscuits, the magic of Coca-Cola. They compared it with the flavors of their mothers' kitchens in Bavaria or Saxony, wondering aloud how such simple ingredients could taste so different here. The mess hall had become not only a place of nourishment, but also a classroom, a window into a culture that was supposed to be their enemy. And yet, beneath the laughter, there was always a current of melancholy. Letters from home reminded them of scarcity, of loved ones scraping together meals from scraps. The guilt of eating so well while their families went hungry was heavy. Some prisoners confessed privately that they could not enjoy certain meals without thinking of their children's empty stomachs. The paradox gnawed at them. To laugh at the absurd abundance was to acknowledge both their luck and their helplessness. But still, they laughed, because sometimes laughter was the only way to soften the edges of a reality too sharp to face head-on. As the seasons passed, the rhythm of camp life became predictable, but the memory of those first bewildering meals remained a touchstone. In later years, when these men returned to Germany and rebuilt lives in the rubble of their homeland, many would recall not the barbed wire or the guard towers first, but the taste of American food and the laughter it inspired. Some went home determined to tell others that America was not the monster they had been taught to fear. Others carried recipes in their heads, eager to recreate pancakes or fried chicken for their families. The war had stolen much from them, but in an unlikely twist. Captivity had given them the gift of laughter, the kind that comes from astonishment, from tasting something entirely new, and from recognizing, however fleetingly, that even enemies can share joy at the same table. When autumn settled across the American heartland and the leaves began to turn, the rhythm of camp life for the German prisoners took on a slower, steadier pace. By then, the shock of abundance in their meals had mellowed into routine, but it never lost its undertone of strangeness. They still laughed at the sight of syrup cascading over pancakes, or shook their heads at the crackle of bacon, but the novelty had given way to something deeper. Food was no longer only a curiosity. It had become a bridge, a daily ritual that softened the sharp edge of captivity. Each meal was both a reminder of the war left behind and a glimpse of a life they could never have imagined. In those mess halls, surrounded by their comrades and watched by American guards who increasingly felt more like wardens of routine than enemies, the prisoners began to reflect on what it meant to be here, in this land of plenty. While their families starved across the ocean, conversations grew more thoughtful. Around the long wooden tables, men spoke quietly of home, of the ration lines in Berlin or Munich, of mothers standing in queues for hours for a loaf of bread. They spoke of letters filled with desperation, of wives writing about patching children's shoes with scraps, of potatoes stretched into weeks of meals. The laughter that had once burst so easily over Coca-Cola or pie now carried a tinge of guilt. Many prisoners admitted that they sometimes pushed their plates away, unable to eat, without imagining the faces of those they loved. Yet hunger always won, and they ate, because to refuse was futile. Still, the contradiction haunted them. They were prisoners, yet in some ways they were eating better than the people they had sworn to fight for. And then came Thanksgiving. For many prisoners, it was their first encounter with an American holiday, and they had no idea what to expect. Rumors ran through the camp in the days leading up to it that the Americans would serve a feast so large it would shame every meal that came before, that there would be foods none of them had ever dreamed of, that perhaps even civilians would join. When the day arrived, the rumors proved true. The mess hall was decorated with small American flags, and the kitchen staff seemed to have worked around the clock. Trays appeared heavy with roasted turkeys, their skin glistening with butter, bowls of stuffing seasoned with herbs, oceans of mashed potatoes, rivers of gravy, cranberry sauce both tart and sweet, and most unbelievable of all, pumpkin pies. The Germans sat in stunned silence as the trays were carried down the rows. It was not just food, it was spectacle. At first the laughter was muted. The prisoners did not know how to react to such deliberate celebration. The guards explained the holiday, its story of gratitude and harvest, and the irony was not lost on the Germans. They were the enemy, after all, yet they were included in this ritual of Thanksgiving. Slowly they began to eat, the flavors strange and comforting all at once. The pumpkin pie provoked another round of laughter. It looked like bread, but tasted like sweet custard, spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, flavors foreign to many of them. Some declared it magnificent. Others wrinkled their noses in confusion. But whether they liked it or not, they laughed because it was absurd, because it was generous, and because it reminded them that the world was larger than the narrow confines of war. These feasts, and even the daily meals, began to change the way the prisoners thought about America. They had been taught to see it as decadent, weak, soft. Yet here, the food itself told a different story. Of abundance, of resilience, of a people who could fight a war on 2 continents and still fill their tables with plenty. For many Germans, the realization was humbling. They spoke among themselves about how such wealth of resources could only mean that the war was already lost, that they had underestimated the very enemy who now handed them plates piled with fried chicken or beef stew. The laughter at the table sometimes masked deeper fears, the sinking recognition that they were fighting against a machine too vast to defeat. In time, the meals also became a space for unexpected friendships. On work details at nearby farms, prisoners often ate alongside American farmers, sharing sandwiches in the fields. The farmers, many of whom had lost sons in the war, approached the Germans with caution at first, but food eroded suspicion. A German prisoner biting into his first ear of roasted corn would grin sheepishly, and the farmer might chuckle despite himself. Small jokes were exchanged, recipes compared, and slowly barriers softened. Some farmers even sent baskets of food back with the prisoners. Small gestures that echoed larger truths, that food could be a form of peace. By the war's end, the Germans had tasted not only American food, but also American generosity. Many would never forget it. Decades later, memoirs and oral histories were filled with stories of Coca-Cola bottles passed down tables, of the sweetness of apple pie, of laughter that filled rooms heavy with the burden of war. Some former prisoners admitted that those meals changed them more than any propaganda could. They went home not just with recipes, but with a new vision of their former enemy. A few even returned to America after the war, drawn back by the memory of a place that had fed them with dignity. Yet the laughter in those mess halls was not only joy, it was also survival. To laugh at the taste of peanut butter sticking to the roof of one's mouth, to giggle at the fizz of soda, to shake one's head in disbelief at the size of Thanksgiving turkeys. These were acts of reclaiming humanity in the face of despair. They were ways of saying, even in captivity, that life could still surprise, could still astonish, could still delight. And perhaps that was the most profound lesson the prisoners carried with them, that the enemy was human, and that even in the darkest times, food had the power to remind men of their shared place at the table of life.